All right. Now, you've alluded to this a little bit before, so this is interesting. This is called indirect directives. Certain restrictions or demands on behaviors are implied rather than expressed. The logical elements for a given conclusion are supplied, leaving the member to draw the conclusion herself. Leadership remains innocent of issuing any unseemly teachings. So you may be told what a good person would do, but we're not going to tell you what to do. But we're going to lay out all of the things that you should do if you're a good person. But in doing so, the group can deny that it ever forced anyone to do anything, even though there is a great deal of psychological pressure, psychological force for them to do it.
And what I'm tying that to is like the medical pathway and just how people are expected to do that. But also they're not expected to do that, and they're not going to say that. And in fact, they're going to say things like there's no one way to be trans in order to deny that there is any specific path that people think you should go down. Like another thing that I can think of actually was that when I was first transitioning, I still wanted to get pregnant, which was something that there's really two sides to how people feel about that. There's people who have transitioned that are trans men who almost look down on trans men that get pregnant, basically, because why are you doing that? You're supposed to believe that you're a man. Why are you getting pregnant? It's the most female thing you could do. And then there's the other side of it of where people can do whatever they want, sort of thing. Whole bodily autonomy, express yourself the way you think you should express yourself. And I think about that sometimes because I feel like it was something that was never, that's one of those things that was never stated. It was never stated that trans men can't get pregnant, but there is an expectation that they don't. And I don't know if that's really prevalent anymore, but there is definitely like an undertone of you don't do things that men don't do, things that only women can do, which is weird in the context, because it's the context of all of this ambiguity anyway. But anyway, that's another thing I was thinking of. But yeah, in terms of like indirect directives, there is a pathway that people are expected to go down, but it's not really spoken.
That's a pretty important one, it would seem. And I think that's where people point to the question of getting this right as a society is really important, because it can affect something like childbirth, which is such a fundamental and important part of the life of 50% of people or society as a whole. Some people will look at this question of indirect directives, and the way that they'll encounter it is gaslighting. When they say that I've been gaslit, they'll say that somehow the group had these expectations, or that they perceived these expectations, but when they went back and said, hey, this is what you guys expected me to do, they'll say, no, nobody expected you to do that or anything. And it gives them the defensibility. Sounds like you experienced that on this issue.
Yeah. And I'm also thinking about, as you're saying that, I'm thinking about other things, although these were directives, but they'll claim that they were never directives. So for example, it was really common for people to give each other advice on how to get past the gatekeeping. So in other words, people were being encouraged to lie to their professionals in order to be able to access transition.
My appointment was 2 half-hour sections. One was talking to a social worker where she just asked, like, how long have you been experiencing dysphoria? Do you want male characteristics? And I had all these rehearsed answers that maybe I didn't actually genuinely believe, but it's really popular for the trans community to like help each other rehearse answers and tell each other what to say to doctors and stuff like that. So I gave her my answers. She said, okay.
I don't think they really say directly that you should lie to your professionals, but I have seen people actually say you should lie to your professionals. But they try and dance on this little middle ground where, well, we're not telling you to lie, but we're helping you to get past these like oppressive gatekeepers who are trying to prevent you from getting your life-saving medication or whatever. And we'll be totally for that until someone detransitions. And then they'll say things like, oh, you probably just lied to your practitioner, as if they weren't literally telling us to lie to our practitioners.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
And I think I've heard people talk about this just in terms of being told, yeah, if you want to really make the case in your initial interview, you need to talk about how you always saw yourself as a boy, or that was you can never remember not seeing yourself as a boy. And it's constructing a history that is designed to make its way through the system so it can get past all of the gatekeeping, even if it's not true.
And that was in 2009 when those kind of websites that existed to coach people to say the right things and present the right way. And those still exist today. There are whole Tumblr blogs devoted to teaching people what is the appropriate thing to say if they do have to go to a gender therapist. But that whole culture of kind of inter-community coaching has existed. Aaron, you were saying even 20 years ago that existed. It still exists today. And so the whole notion of the concept that gatekeepers exist and it's your kind of duty as a trans person to circumvent that process and get what you're after is not only acceptable, but there's it's admirable that you've overcome the cis gatekeepers to get what you need as a trans person. And that kind of, there's like a righteous framing to it all, I've noticed.
But I can see how the group would not want to say that it was telling people to lie. That's interesting. The prevalence of this concept, is this something that would only show up at those particular points, or is there any other manifestation of the indirect directive?
There's probably other ones. It does feel like a lot of it is implied, like just as it's written, a lot of it is implied rather than expressed. And that's why it's really hard to try and explain it to other people. They'll ask you for the examples and you can't come up with any of the examples.
Or if you can say they said such and such, then they'll say, well, they didn't say definitely. They just said it was a possibility. So they didn't tell you that you needed to do such and such, even though there may be social implications for having done or not done something.
One example I can think of, actually, there is a website, amitransgender.net. And if you visit that website, it just says yes in big letters. And I have argued that, yeah, amitransgender.net, if you go, because if you are thinking, am I transgender, then obviously you're transgender. That's what the idea is. And then it gives you a whole bunch of resources, to read.
Amitransgender.net. Existence precedes essence. Okay, that sounds like some very interesting topics.
I tell people all the time that one of the things I heard the most was, if you think you're transgender, you are. And also things like, oh, cisgender people do not think about their gender this much. Stuff like that. And that is sort of a way of putting a direction that you should go in your mind. So for example, with amitransgender.net just says yes in big letters. So it's telling you what to do. But if you link that to someone, then people will be all like, oh, it's just telling you to look for more information. It's not doing anything. Yeah.
But it already plants that idea, which maybe we'd have more resistance as adult people who have already gone through the process of solidifying our identity. But for young people who are now confronted with all these different options, it's less clear. All right. Let's go ahead and give this one a score.
Okay.
Indirect directives. What do you think?
We'll say moderate.
How frequently? Yeah. Okay.
It is pretty frequent.